Good morning, I'm Dr. Anne Casson. This morning I'm planning to give you an overview of the Faith in the Nexus report findings, looking at some of the essential aspects. The full report provides detailed insights and analysis of our findings and is available to download from the NICER website. There will be time for further discussion and an opportunity for questions and answers in the afternoon sessions. Or do please feel free to email us with more specific questions you may have after today. The plan is then to look briefly at the research project and then at 5 key findings: reflection, faith talk, rhythm of the church's year and the Bible, the church, school and the local church, spiritual well-being, and then to conclude with the key messages. Faith in the Nexus was a 3-year extensive empirical mixed methods research study undertaken by the National Institute for Christian Education Research at Canterbury Christ Church University. The aim of the research was to understand how the work of schools impacted on the spiritual life of a child at home, and also see the effects of a connection with the local church. We wanted to do this to help support schools in the work, but also those in the church community who supported schools. The research team consisted of myself, Dr. Sabina Holbert, Dr. Mary Woolley and Professor Bob Bowie. The first question to be answered is, what do we mean by nexus? Now, a nexus is a focus of connection. The focus of this research, the connections within the nexus, are school, church and home. We wished to capture as much as possible the perspective of the child. Thus, interview questions were open-ended, such as, what happens in school or home which helps you explore faith or spiritual things? Definitions were left vague for the children to interpret as they saw fit. Trying to capture the child's perspective is important, because children's expressions and experience of the faith tradition and spirituality are different from those of adults. They are not just watered-down versions of adult engagement with faith or the spiritual dimension. The project involved 20 church primary schools, a cross-section of Church of England and Catholic primary schools in different socio-economic areas spread widely across the country. We are grateful to all who took part: the heads, staff, pupils, parents, clergy and governors, not to forget office staff and lunchtime supervisors. Now, I visited each of these schools twice throughout the project and conducted focus group interviews with 187 pupils and 267 adults. Following an initial analysis of the interviews, Dr. Sabina Holbert devised a quantitative online survey which was administered to over 1,000 people, 730 pupils and 272 adults in spring 2019. Dr. Mary Woolley conducted an in-depth study of the role of parachurch organisations in these 20 schools. The research was enhanced by an invaluable consultation process, and we're very grateful to those who took part, many of whom are here today. This grounded the research and sharpened the focus on improving and strengthening current policy and practice. Now, one of the most striking findings was how pupils spoke of seeking out reflection time and space at home. Now, both reflection and prayer are used within the report. To echo the pupils' use of these two terms, they used reflection and prayer interchangeably. However, a few differences could be identified. Reflection was about quiet space and time, thinking about big questions of God, the world, concerns for others and for self. Prayer was about praying to God, or for relatives. Prayers could be written down or read. Parents, in fact, were more likely to talk about children praying at home than reflecting. Prayer tended to be framed within a Christian tradition as opposed to reflection, which appeared less connected to traditional practices. Children reflect on many things to do with faith and well-being, and this is one of my favourite quotes up on the screen. They also talked of praying or talking to God. Sometimes I talk to myself because I think that I'm talking to God. My great nan's 94 and I pray about her. They reflected on their behaviour. One child said, when I know I should apologise, I usually go to the beach. It's just a nice place where you can hear the sea and the seagulls. It's a nice place to relax. Reflection spaces provide space to think, to seek meaning, to contemplate and be still. The spaces pupils created at home, the prayer corners in the bedrooms and the reflection times when children were outdoors, were often modelled on what happened in school. Church primary schools in this study provided plenty of spaces for children to reflect, in the classroom and in the playground. A theme that emerged, particularly in schools with interactive reflection spaces, was how pupils expressed ownership of these spaces. For example, the spiritual garden in School 5 had been designed by a pupil worship committee. They described how they designed it as an interactive space, appealing to all the senses, and they were thinking how they could improve on this for their next one. As one said, I'd probably make it more spacious for more people to go, because you're only allowed 5 in at a time. I think we do need more space. Our diversity of provision in school could influence how children sought and created time and space to reflect at home. There were many ways in which children engaged with prayer in school, which are not present in the home. Prayer teas, boards and prayer clubs. What was striking was that parents' responses to questions about prayer focused on formal prayer, such as the Lord's Prayer or school prayers. There was a difference in the way pupils spoke about prayer and reflection and the way children did. There may be difference in language and framing of prayer and reflection between schools and between school, home and school. But still, pupils' appreciation of this time and expression of need was common across all schools. Few children mentioned church as a place to reflect. The church is absent here, and what children identify as a time of need is critical. This space and time is essential for well-being, and many children, like adults, had no or little quiet time in their daily life. Children's desire for solitude is perhaps not sufficiently recognised in home, school or church. Adult-led initiatives for children emphasise providing activities rather than facilitating opportunities for wandering and silence. Pupils spoke of exploring faith and spiritual life in the home in terms of asking questions. They valued opportunities to ask open-ended questions about God, creation, death, and for others to listen to their opinions. Church primary schools provided the time and the space to talk about faith and spiritual matters or ask challenging questions. However, some adults struggled to respond. Some avoided such conversations, and the role of grandparents or the older generation in engaging in these conversations cannot be underestimated. One of the key findings of this research was children's desire to explore existential questions, particularly about God, creation, science and religion and death. For the most part, children were looking for time and space to explore these questions rather than a definite answer. Church schools are places where talking about faith is normal. Pupils perceived RE to make an important contribution to stimulating questions in the home. As one child pointed out, RE makes it fun. It encourages people to ask questions. A parent who described herself as a non-believer explained that any discussions about faith in the home were always sparked by school activities. Many parents, clergy and other stakeholders were not aware of the depth of study and the level of discussions that people engaged in within RE. We found that children more often than not are the initiators of faith talk in the home. The traditional understanding of faith talk in the home is in the transmission from parent to child. What became apparent in this research project was that talking about faith was instigated by the child more often than not. This was particularly noticeable when there was an otherwise absence of religious language or faith encounters in the home. How did parents respond to children's questions about faith? Well, adults' responses to these questions varied. Many engaged in conversations with their children and enjoyed exploring challenging questions about God and creation. For some, faith talk was something that happened in school, not in the home. However, others suggested the child look for an expert to answer the question, such as a teacher or local clergy. There was an underlying assumption that other people know the right answer to these questions. It was grandparents or the older generations that they turned to, who were seen as most likely to engage with open conversations. Others did not engage in conversation as they were concerned about influencing their child's belief. Some parents focused on an open-mindedness of allowing the child to make their own mind up. The expectation that a young child can construct their own identity does not consider the need for a critical skill to evaluate the threads needed to weave such an identity. Nor does it account for how independently an individual might choose freely among other influencing factors. Parents may be reluctant to talk about faith for various reasons. This poses a major challenge to support an exploration of faith and spiritual life. These findings call into question the traditional understanding of the parental role in the transmission of faith. Many children are not passive recipients, but actively seeking meaning. There is a need to encourage adults to talk and to stimulate thought with the child, rather than avoid talking about faith for fear of giving it a wrong answer. All adults need to acknowledge that there are no definite or right or wrong answers for many of the children's questions. Being open to exploring together could facilitate more opportunities to explore faith-related matters at home. The key conclusion is then that children need to be viewed as active participants in religious socialisation and spiritual development, rather than as more passive recipients of parental influences. The rhythm of the church's year. Now, we found that children talked about faith-related matters in the home more than they did faith-related matters. However, what emerged was that families do engage more with faith-related activities at certain times of year, linked to key Christian festivals. Evidence of increased school activities at these times rippled into the home environment. For example, parents and pupils spoke of the reverse Advent calendar, preparation for festivals. The pattern of the church's year is embedded and strategically prioritised by these primary schools and clergy. For example, one minister said, "I really do buy passionately into the idea of the church year, the seasons, the moving from Lent into Easter and Pentecost into autumn, into the seasons' changes and then Christmas. They will keep going round and round every year. By the time they've had it for 7 years, they'll have got it." Now, to turn to encounters with the Bible, it became apparent that while in school there was engagement with Bible stories in RE, in collective worship, through initiatives such as Open the Book, children rarely read the Bible at home, and they're more likely to do so in private when they do. What happens in school that has the potential to facilitate opportunities? Well, there are a variety of initiatives, such as gifts of Bibles, Bibles in the school library, experiences of Open the Book. We found that the gift of a Bible may facilitate exploration in the home. When children spoke of reading the Bible at home, more often than not, they mentioned it had been a gift from grandparents or from the school, although sometimes the church had funded this. We also found that inviting parents into Open the Book worship facilitated conversations about the Bible stories in the home. Mention of Open the Book highlights the role of parachurch organisations that engage with schools and sometimes function as a bridge between school and church, bringing faith activity into school and engaging with school families, sometimes in a way that the local church does not. However, engagement with the Bible in school did not seem to ripple widely into the home environment. The crux of the research findings is there is potential scope here for increasing opportunities for children to explore scripture in the home. Major challenges are a lack of resources in the home environment, whether Bible or family knowledge and understanding of Bible stories. We believe there's a clear need to review approaches taken around engagements with biblical narratives in the wider life of the school. However, there's a need to rebuild confidence amongst teachers as voyagers into Bible narratives, to recreate visibility of the Bible in the life of the school, and to explore new practices. The absence of clear and successful practice in our findings means that we cannot really recommend models that we know that work. One of the clear findings from the analysis of the online survey results was that where a strong active relationship between church and school was perceived, there was more evidence of faith-related activity at home. This became clear when we looked at how pupils in the different schools reported a sense of connection to school and to church. The statistics in the graph lead us to some compelling findings, but we do not have time to go into details of the graph here. You can find those in the report. In Sabina's session at 2:30 this afternoon, we'll go into much greater detail about statistics behind the findings. Just to say, the blue bars on the graph show that pupils' sense of connection to school varies slightly, but was fairly consistent over the schools. Now, the orange bars, the connection to the church, show a much wider range of differences. When we unpack these differences, we could see a strong relation between a perception of a strong connection with school and church and the reporting of more faith-related activity in the home. How did pupils see this connection? Well, for children and for parents, the connection with the local church was made visible by the presence of the minister in school, participation in worship at the church, schoolwork displayed within the local church, and being in close proximity to church. The engagement of the local minister, vicar or priest in school was noticed and appreciated by pupils and staff. Where the connection was strong, school and church leaders had prioritised this relationship. As one priest said, it's simply a question of priorities. What do I decide to spend my time doing? I would like to get over to school more often, you know. You know, in the middle of everything else, it's just good fun to come down to school. What was of interest was that the connection did not always have to be with the local parish church. In the absence of such a connection, some school leaders established links with other denominations, parachurch organisations or religious orders. The research identified many barriers which prevented collaborative working within the Nexus, such as broken, fragile, fragmented relationships between school and church or between church and school families. For some church schools, the challenges of sustaining this connection between church and school were structural. For example, no local church building or community. For others, the challenge was rebuilding broken, fragmented relationships between leaders, overcoming misunderstandings by both church community and school families of what it means to be connected to the church. Several schools embraced the challenge of supporting families with no or limited knowledge or language about faith or lack of skills to negotiate an exploratory discussion of spiritual matters. The spiritual and pastoral support offered by church schools to school families is highlighted throughout the report. We believe that changes can be made by targeted and effective dissemination of the key findings to significant influencers and animators, through a sustained campaign that is integrated with the stakeholder activities and strategies, particularly growing faith in the Church of England, and through institutional support of those influencers and animators. The formal identification, recognition and nurture of these animators who have formed links with the school in a spiritual support provision is a clear priority. We found evidence that many of the church school families who perceive themselves as belonging to church express their connection only through school. Some of the church school families saw engagement with Open the Church and Messy Church activities as belonging to church. Measuring a sense of belonging in Sunday church attendance did not seem relevant for many families. Now, some clergy justified their lack of engagement with church primary schools by saying the school families or the school staff were non-church-going or non-practising Christians. This research highlighted an expression of a sense of belonging to the church through school, which is perhaps best expressed through a sense of being occasional belongers. The problem with viewing a sense of belonging through the lens of church attendance is that this was not a priority for many parents and pupils. In fact, many who do not attend Sunday church service define themselves as Christian. A consideration of how church school families described their faith identity gave a picture of a fluid, flexible identity. Now, if ministers do not work closely with the school, in that case they are disconnecting from people who consider themselves as part of the Christian family. The implications being the powerful impact of these positive relationships between school and church have on aspects of family faith life is mostly unseen, but it is apparent in the significance that church school families put on the connection with the local church. Evidence in this study should inspire collaborative working between church school, church and home. It should encourage churches and schools to prioritise and understand their relationships with each other, establish effective means of communication within the Nexus, and overcome silos between ministry provision and school needs across the diocese. How? Well, relationships between school and church need to be strategically prioritised. Church leaders should be persistent in building links into schools directly or indirectly through lay-led initiatives. School leaders should be bold in seeking out the links with the church where there are none, seeing the church as a community supporting service. Churches should consider and plan for how they may be seen as places of spiritual reflection and prayer for children. We suggest that church ministers and representatives continue to adopt welcome and hospitality stance towards all school families. They need to seek and understand the different ways these parents and families might see themselves as connected to church beyond traditional signs of Sunday participation. What are the key messages then we want you to take away from this report? Why is it important? Well, we argue it's important for the spiritual well-being of children. Now, we did not set out to measure the spiritual well-being of pupils, but what we can say from this research is that there is evidence from the children's responses that identifies what they see as contributing to their spiritual well-being. Opportunities to ask questions and discuss big issues. Time and space to reflect. sense of belonging to the school and to the church, the relationships they develop with each other, adults, and for some, with God. We found that primary schools within this study sustained an environment in which children's spiritual needs were being met, with time for questions, spaces for reflection, and that sense of belonging to a caring community. In school, children used reflection spaces when they felt sad, when thinking about somebody had died, when they were worried or concerned about their own actions. They raised questions about what happens after death, not just in response to grief. Pupils, parents and staff remarked on how children appreciated and needed quiet space and time of reflection because it enabled them to unwind, calm down and relieve stress. This feeling of safety, of deep sense of security in these spaces must be recognised and valued. Concern for the spiritual well-being of all children should be the main focus of the Nexus. The findings from this report suggest there needs to be strategic prioritisation of children's spiritual well-being. What is clear from the research is that no one way is sufficient in itself. A variety of approaches from different people, different spheres of life, are needed to create an environment in which spiritual well-being can flourish. The Faith in the Nexus report highlights some ways that the three parts of the Nexus, school, home and church, working together, can contribute to spiritual well-being. What do we need to do then? Provide space and time for the child to reflect, think and pray. Embed opportunities for children to talk about and explore existential questions. Prioritise encounters with experiences of lived religion in the form of a variety of faith-related activities, people, places, scriptures and events. How can we do this? Acknowledge the child as a dynamic initiator and co-constructor of faith and spirituality in school, home, and help adults identify this engagement. Sustain a strong connection between the local church and church school. Identify and remove barriers to collaborative working within the Nexus. Thank you for listening to this talk, and thank you again to all who have contributed to this research project. The report is now downloadable from our website, nicer.org.uk. Thank you.